Horror and the Oscars. Whenever the two cross paths, it really is a mini miracle. My first video in this series last month looked at Frederick March's Best Actor win for 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and with that victory being at the 5th Academy Awards, very early in the ceremony's run, you'd think there would have been some more nominations and wins in the years that followed. Well, as it turned out, this recognition of a scary movie at the Oscars turned out to be quite the anomaly, because throughout the next 3 decades, the horror genre was almost completely ignored by the Academy. The rest of the 1930s, all of the 1940s and 50s, there's almost nothing. You get a random technical nod here and there, Best Sound for The Bride of Frankenstein, Best Special Effects for The Invisible Man Returns, Best Cinematography Black and White for The Uninvited. The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1945 did okay, Angela Lansbury receiving a Best Supporting Actress nomination, the black and white cinematography winning an Academy Award. In the 1950s, only The Bad Seed from 1956 is recognized, with 4 Oscar nominations, 3 of them in the acting categories. Not to say that the 50s was a good time for the genre, but still. No, it was going to take the master of suspense, hot off a massive global hit, at the height of his artistic powers, to craft a scary movie classic that would take audiences and the Academy by storm. In this second video in my new series, Horror and the Oscars, we're going to look at one of my favorite films by my all-time favorite director, Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho, and discuss its impressive run during the 1961 award season that resulted in multiple Academy Award nominations, including Best Director for Hitchcock and Best Supporting Actress for Janet Leigh. And we're going to answer the question why. Why was this horror film able to crash the Oscars when so many before had simply crashed and burned? Hi, my name is Brian Rowe, this is the awards contender, and my friend Andrew Campbell is here with me today to chat everything Psycho. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. By 1960, Alfred Hitchcock was an icon the world over, one of the few movie directors many people recognized due to his successful TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And in the 1950s, he gave us one of the most incredible runs any director has ever given us in a single decade. Strangers on a Train, Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, Vertigo, North by Northwest, and those are just the super famous ones. His work was admired, often successful, and he was respected by many, including the Academy. Hitchcock received 5 Academy Award nominations for Best Director in his long career. Can you name off the top of your head all 5? Don't worry, I'll wait. Okay, here they are, as I talked about with my friend Andrew. Not everyone knows this. He was nominated for a Best Director Oscar 5 times, like throughout his many decades of filmmaking, for Rebecca, Lifeboat, Spellbound, Rear Window, and Psycho. Wow. And that's a good like trivia. Like people who know their Oscars, I'm like, do you know the 5 nominations for Hitchcock? Because nobody remembers Spellbound. That's the one I can really stump people on. Most people would say, oh, well, clearly Vertigo, right? Nope, he didn't get in for Vertigo. The closest he got to a win, I would argue, was for Rebecca, since that film won the Best Picture Oscar, but that was the year of The Grapes of Wrath as well, and John Ford took the Best Director prize for that film. However, as we got closer to the end of the 1950s, Hitchcock was clearly in the Academy's good graces, and if he directed a movie that impressed them, a 5th Best Director nomination looked to be in the cards, not for Vertigo, shockingly enough, although today it's considered by many his best film and one of the greatest movies ever made. In 1958, Vertigo received mixed reviews from critics and was a huge flop at the box office. He bounced back a year later with the blockbuster hit North by Northwest, but that movie was likely looked at too much as popular entertainment to be considered for top Oscar categories, although it did get into Best Original Screenplay, Art Direction, Set Direction, and Film Editing. After North by Northwest, Hitchcock figured he could make anything, really. His career was on top of the world. What did he choose to direct next? A black and white slasher horror film, Psycho, based on the novel by Robert Bloch. Hitchcock's assistant Peggy Robertson introduced him to the book. He bought the rights, but then the unthinkable happened. Paramount rejected the project. Yep, they rejected Alfred Hitchcock. So what did he do? He said, fine, I will personally finance the project myself and film Psycho at Universal, for a smaller budget with my Alfred Hitchcock Presents crew. He also saved money by shooting in black and white, which he found necessary for artistic reasons as well. The shower scene would have been too gory in color. He cast Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins at fractions of their usual fees, and come November 1959, cameras were rolling on Psycho. You know the story. Real estate secretary Marion Crane, played by Leigh, steals $40,000, flees the city, and stops for the night at the Bates Motel, where she comes to meet the shy and slightly odd Norman Bates, played by Perkins.
We're all in our private traps, clamped in them, and none of us can ever get out. We scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other.
Soon after getting settled in her room, she realizes she's made a mistake and will return the stolen money tomorrow morning. Then she takes a shower. The most shocking movie moment in ages worked its magic on audiences to thunderous screams and chaos in the aisles upon Psycho's theatrical release in June of 1960. And it remains a horrifying and unexpected moment today, as I talked about with Andrew.
The main character getting killed off halfway through the movie is a pretty wild thing to do. Movies today don't typically do that at all. I think that just completely shocked audiences back then and even today to see that happen.
Psycho turned out to be the perfect storm of good timing, amazing word of mouth, ultimate shock value, and absolutely brilliant publicity. Because of Marion's death early in the movie, Hitchcock worried latecomers into the theater would keep asking, "Where's Janet Leigh?" So he instituted a no late admissions policy, which heightened audiences' curiosities. All around the country, lines wrapped around the theater. Psycho was a smash hit, the second highest grossing film of 1960, behind Spartacus. Initial reviews were mixed, and critics didn't come to assess the movie more positively until later. Remember, this was 1960. The horror genre was looked at by many as bottom-of-the-barrel entertainment of cheap thrills and stuffy gothic costume dramas. There really hadn't been any horror films quite like Psycho before, movies with scares and kill scenes set in the modern world with characters that kind of resembled the average moviegoer. I mean, pretty much everybody takes showers. This movie had real people in relatable situations who then get stabbed to death when they're least expecting it. Many critics in 1960 didn't know what to make of it. Despite the film's massive popularity, Psycho is now one of the most famous horror films ever made. It's probably Hitchcock's most famous movie. Its direction and performances and unusual structure continue to be studied in film schools, and honestly, it's a movie that still rips in 2023 and beyond. But yeah, only some critics loved it at the time, so it wasn't clear if Psycho would make it into the Oscars. There were no guarantees. Films of this genre were for the most part not taken seriously by the Academy. Would their respect for Hitchcock pull the movie through to at least get a handful of nominations? In early 1961, there were only a few precursor ceremonies before the Oscars, and you know what? Things looked pretty good for Psycho because it made it into all three. Joseph Stefano was nominated at the Writers Guild Awards, Hitchcock was nominated at the Directors Guild Awards, and Janet Leigh got into Best Supporting Actress at the Golden Globes, and she won. There's a lovely picture of Leigh with her then husband Tony Curtis after her win, and with that, she was arguably the frontrunner going into the 33rd Academy Awards held on April 17, 1961, hosted by the one and only Bob Hope. Leigh indeed got an Oscar nomination and Best Supporting Actress for her performance in Psycho. She and Curtis were even the first presenters of the night, giving the awards for Best Documentary Short and Feature.
Don't let that hand-holding bit fool you. One's an imposter and the other's a psycho.
Thank you, Bob.
Psycho received 3 other Academy Award nods. First up were Best Art Direction, Set Direction Black and White, and Best Cinematography Black and White, 2 nominations I talked about with Andrew.
Now, something that helped Psycho was that in the early 60s, they had some of these technical categories for both color films and black and white films. So 5 movies are nominated for art direction black and white, 5 movies are nominated for art direction color. So that also helped it get in.
There, of course, was also Best Director for Alfred Hitchcock. Yep, Hitch received his 5th, and what would prove to be his final Best Director Oscar nomination for a slasher horror movie made on the cheap. Not too shabby, I would say. The Academy didn't allow their common dismissal of the genre to let Psycho go unrecognized, although let's be honest, the film should have placed in other categories too. Best Adapted Screenplay for starters, Best Picture, duh, and the most obvious category, one of the worst snubs, I would argue, in the entire history of the Academy Awards, Best Actor for Anthony Perkins. I will have lots more to say about this awful omission in an upcoming video, but yeah, Perkins should have gotten in there. Andrew agrees with me that Perkins gives a stellar performance.
He is so good. Like, he is so creepy. The way he moves his body, his mannerisms, like everything is so well thought out. Like, he puts so much effort and time into this character. It's so captivating. I was in love with it.
He is just so eerie, so strange, so magnetic as Norman Bates. It's, in my eyes, one of the greatest performances ever put on film, and this turned out not to be the last time Perkins played Norman Bates, which Andrew and I discussed.
He got 2 sequels out of it too, I believe. So
3.
I mean, 3.
You haven't
sequels?
seen Psycho 4?
No, I didn't know.
Well, I guess Psycho 4 is technically both a sequel and a prequel, and he's in that too.
Okay. I mean, I've seen Bates Motel, and maybe I may have to compare those later on.
Of the 4 categories the movie did get into at the Academy Awards, did it have a chance at winning anything? Supporting actress for Janet Leigh was its best shot by far, given her Golden Globe win. She was up against Shirley Jones for Elmer Gantry, Glynis Johns for The Sundowners, Shirley Knight for The Dark at the Top of the Stairs, and Mary Ure for Sons and Lovers. If Shirley Jones hadn't been in the category, I do think Leigh would have taken this, but Elmer Gantry was nominated for Best Picture, and Burt Lancaster won Best Actor for his performance in the film, so it was Jones who took the gold trophy. Do I think Leigh deserved to win this over Jones? Here's what Andrew and I talked about.
You know, it's funny. I mean, this might be controversial to say. I mean, I love Janet Leigh in Psycho. There's nothing she does in the movie that's necessarily like Academy Award winning. It's not a performance that you immediately go, oh, that should have won an Oscar, is it?
For me, I think Anthony Perkins was so good. When I think of the performances, I think of his, for sure.
I mean, I do think she won the Golden Globe and got nominated for the Oscar in part because of the shocking nature of her removal from the narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the big talking points, I imagine, in the movies in 1960. By 1960, Janet Leigh was a big star. She had been in Touch of Evil. She'd been in a bunch of stuff. And then for her to be killed off like 40 minutes into the movie, it was just so shocking to audiences, to critics. So there was probably a lot of discussion just about that element, and it kept her name in the mix all the way to award season. That's probably what happened.
This proved to be Leigh's only Oscar nomination in her long and celebrated career, but how cool was it to see her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, pay tribute to her when she won the Academy Award in the same category, Best Supporting Actress, 62 years later.
And my mother and my father were both nominated for Oscars in different categories. I just won an Oscar.
The Best Art Direction Oscar in 1961 went to The Apartment, that year's Academy Award winner for Best Picture. Best Cinematography went to Sons and Lovers, a film that got 7 Oscar nods, including Best Picture. And then in Best Director, Hitchcock didn't have a chance in hell against Billy Wilder, who won for The Apartment. Why not? Here's what I discussed with Andrew.
I don't think he had a chance to win on Psycho, mainly because the movie was not nominated for Best Picture. And I don't if you look throughout the years, I mean, it's almost impossible to win the Best Director Oscar if your movie is not nominated for Best Picture. It's almost unheard of, I would say. So that's why I think this was just like kind of a legacy nomination. He was very well respected in the industry, but I mean, he's probably in 4th or 5th place. Like, I don't think he had a shot in hell to win, sadly.
The Apartment was just a better loved movie overall, and Billy Wilder had also completed an incredible decade of filmmaking that began with Sunset Boulevard and culminated with Some Like It Hot and The Apartment. I often wonder if there might have been some kind of career narrative for Hitchcock, given that he was on his 5th Oscar nomination and had never won, unlike Wilder, who had won 3 Academy Awards before, Best Director and Screenplay for The Lost Weekend, and Best Screenplay for Sunset Boulevard. Unfortunately, Psycho not getting into Screenplay or Picture showed that Hitchcock's win here was the nomination itself, but at the end of the day, at least he's there, am I right?
I mean, I'm just happy he got in for this movie. Like, he could have easily been 6th or 7th place and hadn't gotten in the final 5. I'm happy that nomination is in the history of the Academy Awards, that Hitchcock got a Best Director Oscar nomination for Psycho.
The Master of Suspense never received another Academy Award nod. I think he should have gotten in for 1972's Frenzy, but thankfully he did get an Irving G. Thalberg honorary Oscar in 1968. His speech was priceless.
Thank you.
So how ultimately did a scary slasher movie crash the Academy Awards? I think it was 3 main reasons. Number 1, Alfred Hitchcock first and foremost. If Psycho had been made by a nobody director, I'm not convinced it gets in, actually. Hitchcock had enough clout at the time for each of his films to at least be considered for Academy Award nominations. I mean, Rear Window from 1954 is also a genre film, and that got into the Oscars, including Best Director for Hitchcock, and so the Academy clearly saw enough things in Psycho they liked to nominate it. Number 2, huge box office. If Psycho had bombed like Hitchcock's Vertigo 2 years before, again, I think they ignore it. But Psycho becoming the second highest grossing movie of 1960 meant it was always going to be in the conversation. And then number 3, although some critics were mixed on the movie, it did receive enough positive notices to boost the film's profile long into award season, Psycho receiving a solid 4 Oscar nominations total. Not overly remarkable, I guess you could say, but it could have been worse. The Academy could have snubbed Psycho completely on the basis of its genre. I mean, a major movie star gets stabbed to death in a shower in a movie made in 1960. That it got into the Oscars at all, especially in a couple big categories, I think is really, really cool in retrospect. And the decades that have followed have only been kind to the power, the terror, the genius of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, as Andrew and I talked about at the end of our conversation.
This is many, many, many years before the slasher movie craze, the late 70s and 80s. And I mean, Psycho really ahead of its time and fresh and fun. And it holds up 63 years later. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I think for me, the reason it holds up is just that plot twist of 50 minutes in, there's a complete change of main characters, introduce new characters who are now going to carry the movie. I mean, it keeps you on your toes, and that's hard to come by these days for sure.
There's just not another film quite like Psycho in the history of cinema, and it's for sure a big success story in the history of the Oscars. Very few horror films went on to be recognized by the Academy for the rest of the 1960s, only a handful really. That goes for the very beginning of the 1970s as well. It wasn't until a controversial, unavoidable blockbuster opened on cinema screens the day after Christmas in 1973 that a horror film was finally on its way to taking the Oscars truly, monumentally by storm in a variety of categories, including Best Director and Best Picture. Oh yes, my video about The Exorcist is coming. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments below, how do you think Psycho did at the 33rd Academy Awards? Do you think it should have won a prize or two? And do you agree with me that Anthony Perkins absolutely should have gotten into the Best Actor category? We'll see you next time at the Awards Contender.